Hello Revolution students, today I'm going to look at the 2020 Revolutions exam and I'm going to go through the questions on the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution in section A and section B of the exam. I'm hoping this will be of use to you in your preparation for this year's exam, so good luck, sit back and enjoy. So let's get into it. So I've got the exam up here, 2020 exam, and you can see that you've got 2 hours for writing and 15 minutes reading time. In your 15 minutes reading time, you look through both section A and section B, and you look at the questions on the Russian and the Chinese revolutions in both sections, and you read through the extracts, and then you decide from that which revolution you're going to do for section A and which revolution you're going to do for section B. Remembering that if you do one revolution in section A, then you must do the other revolution you have studied in section B. So if you decide to do the Russian questions in section A, then you must do the Chinese questions in section B. So let's get into it and have a look. So I turn over the first page, go past this blank page, and then I get into the index here for section A, and I can see that the Russian section starts on page 12, China starts on page 16. So I don't even look at the American section. I don't need to look at the questions on the French Revolution because I didn't study them. It'd be a waste of time. So I go straight to page 12. So I'm going to zip through and I'm going to go to page 12 here, and here we are. So this is section A on the Russian Revolution and section A part 1 and its source analysis. So in 2020 we had source 1, a written extract, source 2 was another written extract, and then source 3 was an image. So you had 3 sources, and then you had 3 questions that you had to answer in relation to those sources. So let's just have a look at these sources. So source 1, we've got a little summary of it up here. Extracts from Tsar Nicholas II's letter to his mother on the 19th of October 1905, 2 days after he signed the October Manifesto. Okay, so this is the signing of, this is all about the October Manifesto. Source 2, extracts from historical interpretation, comparing the powers of Nicholas II and powers of the Duma, and have a quick scan through here. And we can see that, this is about the fundamental laws. Okay, so the October Manifesto and the fundamental laws. The October Manifesto, the key point about that, if you remember from your studies, was that apart from the Tsar promising various civil liberties to the Russian people in order to appease them and quell this revolution that was occurring in 1905, the big promise in the October Revolution was the creation of a legislative Duma, a parliament, or Duma is another word for parliament, with law-making powers. So he promised that in the October Manifesto in 1905, and then in the fundamental laws, which he released in April 1906 at the start of the first sitting or thereabouts of the Duma in April 1906, he pretty much broke that promise to create a Duma with law-making powers. He still let the Duma sit, but he said in the fundamental laws that only he had the power to approve laws. So only he had the authority to create laws in Russia, and it broke the promise that he made in the October Manifesto. And this broken promise is a contributing factor right up until the February 1917 revolution, in causing social tension, particularly from the liberals, the intellectuals who had hoped for a legislative Duma for decades. And then if we go to source 3, which is the image, and the image here is of, it looks like, what is the caption or what's the title of the image? Peril, liberty to the Tsar, give him his head. That's the caption down there. It's your only chance and mine. So we have the Tsar in a sleigh driving the Duma forwards, the Duma sleigh, and beside the Tsar, I would say, is liberty. Okay, liberty representing Russian liberty. So this is the only thing that's going to protect Russia, pretty much the main point of this image here. So when you're attempting to answer the questions A, B and C, you think about the time allocated to answer these questions. They're worth 5, 10, 20 marks in total, and you have half an hour to answer all of these questions. If we break it down further, for question A, you have 7.5 minutes. For question B, you have 7.5 minutes. And then question C, you have about 12 and a half minutes. Okay? And if you add 15 minutes, sorry, not 12 and a half minutes, 15 minutes. So 7.5 minutes for A, 7.5 minutes for B, and then 15 minutes for C. Add them all together, that is half an hour. That is a quarter of the time allocated to your exam. And you're trying to, around about anyway, you're sort of aiming for at least 125 words for A, 125 words for B, and at least 250 words for C. Okay? So question A here, using source 1 and your own knowledge, outline the reasons why Tsar Nicholas II decided to set up a Duma and to allow increased rights in October 1905. In answering this question, you have to refer to the source 1, and use your own knowledge. So at least 2 points here. One of those points has to be about source 1, and since source 1 is an extract, a written extract, you should include at least one quote from this source, one key quote from this source in your response to question A here. And then some of your own knowledge, something you understand about the October Manifesto. So a key quote from here, and then a piece of your own knowledge. It could be, as we said, that promise, the key promise that if it's referred to in the source, you could refer to the promise to create a legislative Duma, which it does. And here we are here. The other way out would be to give the people their civil rights, freedom of speech and press, also to have all laws confirmed by a state Duma. Okay, so that's when he makes that promise to give that power to the Duma. So you can refer to that. That could be your reference to source 1. And when you are referring to source 1, you include that quote and make sure that you cite source 1. Something such as, according to source 1 it states that, or according to source 1, and then the quote. You could just have the quote and have quotation marks, and then after it the source in brackets, source 1 in brackets. It's up to you. Outline the reasons why Tsar Nicholas II decided to set up a Duma and to allow increased rights in October 1905. The reason why he set up, you would have studied this already, the reason why he set up a Duma and allowed for increased rights in October 1905 through promulgating this October Manifesto was to appease particularly the Liberals, who were one of the key leaders of the 1905 revolution. And in particular, according to Pipes, it was Milyukov and the cadets, or the Union of Unions, who pretty much led the revolution, or the leaders of the revolution, up to 1905. Once the Tsar issued the October Manifesto, their wish for the creation of a state Duma was satisfied. So they pretty much said, all right, we've got what we've wanted from this revolution, let's stop now. Other groups, the peasants and the workers, were not so satisfied, but the Liberals, Milyukov, etc., they certainly were. So that appeased the Liberals. That's the main point of why the October Manifesto was released by the Tsar. Question B, using sources 2 and 3 in your own knowledge, explain how Tsar Nicholas II weakened the power of the Dumas after October 1905. And if we go back here, there's reference to the fundamental laws, and we can see once again it's a source, so you've got a quote from it. And let's have a look for this key quote. He still appointed all ministers, kept complete control over foreign policy and the military part of the budget, and he is a key part here, and could veto any legislation. It also refers to the bicameral nature below of the Duma, so how he set up two houses, a lower and upper house, and the upper house, most of it was, or at least half of the members, he appointed. So there are a number of checks that he put in place to make sure that laws could not get through or be passed by the Duma without him vetoing them. So that is a reference to the fundamental laws. There's a lot there that you could include. And then, so using sources 2 and 3, so you also have to refer to this image here. And this is, the key here is June 1906, when he's just about to, or he has decided to dissolve the first Duma because of the constant criticisms from the various deputies, the cadets and the Octoberists, the Labourists and so forth. He had enough of them, so he decided to dissolve the Duma. So you can refer to that there. Explain how it's weakened the power of the Dumas after October 1905. You can refer to that, and then how other ways that the powers of the Dumas were weakened. Well, this is after October 1905, so you could talk about some of the other things that occurred, some of the other policies that were put in place by the Tsar. For example, he dissolved the first Duma, he dissolved the second Duma, he dissolved the third Duma. So that's weakening the Dumas right there and then. He also, it's after the second Duma, with the third Duma, he changed, under Stolypin, changed the voting procedures, and meant that only property people could actually vote, which changed the type of deputies who were getting voted in, more conservatives who supported the property classes in Russian society. So that's another change that he put in place. And then finally, C, evaluate the significance of the Dumas in contributing to the outbreak of the February Revolution in 1917. Use evidence to support your answer. With question C here, you can refer to the sources 1, 2 and 3, but you don't need to. You don't need to. In the past, you used to have to, but you no longer need to. So if you don't want to refer to the sources, then don't. However, they are very good. There's a lot of information in here. So for question C, you probably would have referred to them, particularly with the fundamental laws and that broken promise. It's a key contributing factor up to February 1917. This the long-held dream of the Liberals of having a legislative parliament, which the Tsar denied. So you could refer to those sources. The other thing you have to do in question C, when you were responding to it, is you need to include references to historical interpretations, ideally at least 2 historical interpretations which are relevant for the Dumas in relation to how they contributed to February 1917. There's lots of other points you can put, or you could include in your response to question C. Primary sources, there's a number of Okhrana reports. I think there's one from 1913 which refers to the people on the streets of Petrograd and Moscow repeating or echoing the criticisms that have been made by the Duma deputies towards the Tsar, for example, and there's lots of others there. So lots of things you can do here. You could talk about the Viborg appeal as well, after once the first Duma was dissolved in June 1906. Lots of things you can refer to there. Anyway, let's keep moving on. So once you've answered all these questions, A, B and C, in section A, part 1 for the Russian Revolution, then you have to answer the other questions in part 2 for section A on the Russian Revolution. So let's go to those and turned over the page, and here they are here. So we've got question 2 and question 3. Have a look at the marks. They're both, in total, they're worth 20 marks, the same amount that the previous 3 questions were worth, which means 20 marks, which means you have to spend half an hour in total on these two questions. So 15 minutes for question 2, 15 minutes for question 3. Okay, and these 3 questions here and those 2 questions there, they're all the questions you would do on the Russian Revolution if you had done the 2020 exam, and that is half of your exam. Okay. So anyway, let's get into these questions. So, and the other thing about these questions, question 2 and question 3, if you look up here, they are related to consequences of the revolution. So they're after October 1917 and go up to 1927. So these questions are going to be about the new regime that gets that comes into power. This is going to ask you questions about in relation to the Russian Revolution. Once the Bolsheviks get into power, what sort of society do they create? And do they achieve all of the goals that they hope to achieve in creating this new society? And if they don't create the society or achieve all their revolutionary ideals, what were the reasons that stopped them from doing that? What were the challenges that they faced? Okay. Other key questions, or sort of general topics, things. How did the people benefit or not under the Bolsheviks? So that's what these questions will relate or ask about. So question 2 here, let's have a look. Explain how the Civil War threatened the survival of the new regime. Use evidence to support your response. Okay, so that's question 2. And then question 3, explain how Felix Dzerzhinsky influenced the consolidation of power in the new regime. Use evidence to support your response. So these 2 questions, these 2 aren't too bad at all, actually. There's so much information on the Civil War. Explain how the Civil War threatened the survival of the new regime. So you talk about the whites, the white generals. You talk about the foreign powers supporting the whites. You can talk about, lots of points there. You could even go into Makhno and the Greens and, those independent forces, particularly like in the Ukraine and so forth, trying to create, separate countries and so forth. So that's what you can have for the Civil War. For question 3, Felix Dzerzhinsky, well, he was the head of the Cheka. How did he influence the consolidation of power in new regime? So his role in leading the Cheka and the role of the Cheka in firstly attacking political opposition and destroying political opposition within Russia, be they class enemies such as the bourgeoisie or supporters of the whites, etc. You could also talk about his role and the Cheka's role, I suppose, in grain requisitioning, war communism, and the like. So you could talk about the labour camps that were set up too. So there's lots of stuff there, and lots of juicy Dzerzhinsky quotes as well, which you should be able to get from your textbook. So these 2 questions aren't too bad. All right, so there are questions for the Russian revolutions. If you decided for the Russian Revolution, if you decided not to do the Russian Revolution in Section A and instead decided to do the Chinese Revolution, then you would go to page 16. So let's, for argument's sake, that we didn't choose to do Russia in Section A and instead we decided to do China. So let's have a look at China. What questions do they have? So let's go through, and we're page 16 and we start. So we've got sources again. For China, and firstly, before we even go any further, I should have mentioned this before. So you're looking, all these sources are about outcome number 1 for China. So the reasons why the 1949 revolution occurred and why the Chinese communists were successful in the 1949 revolution. So, and it covers the period 1912 to 1949. So source 1 is an image, and source 2 is an extract, and source 3 is an extract. So we've got an image and 2 written extracts. So, and then, sorry, go back down here, and then you can see A, B, and C. So the format is the same as it was for the Russian Revolution questions on source analysis questions. Exactly the same. Marks are the same as well, and the time that you would devote to these questions exactly the same as what you would have devoted for those questions in the corresponding Russian Revolution. Section A, Part 1. Anyway, so let's have a look at what these sources are about. So source number 1. The photo below was taken in Shanghai in March 1927. It shows a workers' militia of non-professional soldiers that had formed with the help of the communists. So we have the Shanghai. This is all going to be about the Shanghai Massacre and the time just after it. Yes, all right. Source 2. The extract below is a historical interpretation of the April 1920 Shanghai Massacre, published in 1991. Yes, all right. It's all about the Shanghai Massacre. And then source 3. A historical interpretation of the consequences of the Shanghai Massacre, first published in 1998. It's good. Let me just have a drink here. It's good with these questions. They're actually indicating when these sources were published. So, you're not going to get confused that, this, if we look up here, we've got this source was historical interpretation of the consequences of the Shanghai Massacre, first published in 1998. So even though this is about 1927, it's actually published in 1998. And it's up here as well. The extract below is a historical interpretation of the April 1927 Shanghai Massacre. I think this information has been put up here just in case students get confused with the date here, for example. So you've got 1991. You think, this occurred in 1991. Most students wouldn't, but under the heat of the exam, under the pressure of the exam, you might get confused. So anyway, this is great to see. So let's have a look at these questions. Question A, using sources 1 and 2 and your own knowledge, outline the events of the Shanghai Massacre. Okay, so source 1 here is the photograph below was taken in Shanghai in March 1927. It shows a worker militia of non-professional soldiers that had formed with the help of the communists. So the time here, March 1927, there's the key date. So this is during the Northern Expedition. And the Northern Expedition was when the Kuomintang and its allies, the CCP and the Comintern, the First United Front, these three allies formed the First United Front. That's when they decided to march north to retake China from the warlords, and the Comintern was that Russian government agency that was set up to support overseas communist revolutions. Okay, so and in Shanghai, the CCP were helping the workers. This is when they helped the workers rise up and take Shanghai pretty much from the warlords and the foreign powers and so forth. And it's just before the Shanghai Massacre, before the Kuomintang, when Jiang Jieshi decides to turn on the CCP. So that's source 1. This is March 1927. The Shanghai Massacre occurs in April 1927, doesn't it? So here we are, source, and so if we go back to question A, using sources 1 and 2 in your own knowledge, and outline the events of the Shanghai Massacre. So already from that image we can see that the role the CCP played in helping the workers rise up in Shanghai. And then we see Jiang Jieshi and his the GMD, and particularly his allies, the Green Gang, the gangsters, and what they did to the workers from this written extract here. The extract below is a historical interpretation of the April 1927 Shanghai Massacre, published in 1991. The Society for Common Progress, commonly known as the Green Gang, led the attack with the support of Jiang Jieshi, Chiang Kai-shek, the Wade Giles version of his name, and the National Revolutionary Army, and that's just another name for the Kuomintang. And we can see down here the Kuomintang, or the Kuomintang, is referred to here. So Kuomintang, that is the pinyin, and Kuomintang is the Wade Giles version of Kuomintang. So And you'll see this with a lot of our written sources for the Chinese Revolution. Sometimes words will be in Pinyin, the Pinyin version, or they may be in the Wei Giles version, but 99% of the time both versions will be given, so you shouldn't have any problems understanding what the extracts are about. So, using sources 1 and 2 in your own knowledge, outline the events of the Shanghai Massacre. The key here, you have to refer to source 1, you have to refer to source 2. So a key feature of source 1 you need to cite in your response, as well as, because source 2 is a written extract, you would have ideally a quote, a key quote from here. Outline the events of the Shanghai Massacre and your own knowledge. So you've got all that. So there's no problem getting information from the sources here. Your own knowledge, you might talk about, for example, Zhou Enlai's role in helping the workers organising that general strike in Shanghai just prior to the Shanghai Massacre. So Zhou Enlai, a key CCP leader, played a key role in helping the workers organise. He actually escaped, as you would know. He also escaped from the massacre, and he went on to have quite an illustrious career in the coming decades within the CCP, and then when they get into power. And he dies just before, a couple of months before, I think, Mao Zedong died in 1976. So anyway, so there's a bit you could talk about there. Question B, using source 3 and your own knowledge, explain how the Shanghai Massacre had an impact on the Chinese Communist Party from 1927 to 1934. So you have to refer to the source 3 here. You need to have a key quote from this source. Explain how, and your own knowledge, one of the key consequences of the Shanghai Massacre for the CCPs, it reorientated them, it changed the way they believed revolution could be conducted successfully in China. The big turning point was that it took a little while, but eventually they realised that revolution would be successful in China if they promoted revolution amongst the peasants rather than amongst the workers. So prior to the Shanghai Massacre, the CCP had spent most of its time trying to create revolution within the cities and to organise the workers to conduct a successful revolution. However, after the Shanghai Massacre, they started focusing more on the peasants, and this is a big key. This was what Mao Zedong was doing in the Jiangxi Soviet, which we'll get to. All right, question C. Evaluate the extent to which the Shanghai Massacre contributed to the development of a revolutionary situation by 1949. Use evidence to support your response. Once again, you could, if you wished, include information from these sources in your response to question C, but you don't have to. You do need to include a couple of historical interpretations and contribute to the development of a revolutionary situation by 1949. So, I mean, really, the key factor, one of the key points here, you'd have to talk about that the CCP redirecting their energies towards promoting revolution in the countryside and gaining the support of the peasants, and that links into the Jiangxi Soviet. It then follows through to the Long March. Mao Zedong plays a key role. Mao is one of the key leaders, perhaps the most important leaders, to say that we should be conducting revolution amongst the peasantry, getting their support rather than trying to garner the support of the workers. And when you remember that the peasants within Chinese society form the vast majority of the population, over 80-90% of the population were peasants, then he had a point. Mao Zedong, another key point you could refer to in question C, you could discuss the Hunan Report, okay? And that Hunan Report, which Mao published in March 1927, just prior to the April 1927 Shanghai Massacre. That Hunan report contains many of his key ideas about revolution. His ideas about the peasants being the key revolutionary class. His idea that the landlords are the class enemies of the peasants. His idea as well that the CCP, the organisation, the party itself, is subordinate to the peasants, and that it needs to listen to the peasants. So some of his key ideas about the mass line and so forth come from, well, you can see the start of it in the Hunan report. A historical interpretation you could use in your response to question C. Meisner makes the point that if it wasn't for the Shanghai Massacre, then Mao Zedong probably would have been kicked out of the CCP because of what he had written in the Hunan report. And Meisner argues that if the Shanghai Massacre, because the Shanghai Massacre occurred, the CCP leadership, because Mao was not the leader of the CCP at this time, he was just one of the leaders, but and not even the most important one. Meisner argues probably the CCP leadership would have kicked Mao Zedong out of the party. But that didn't occur. The Shanghai Massacre occurred, and Mao was able to retreat first to Jingjiangshan, and then further south to Rujin and the Jiangxi Soviet, and set up that Soviet, and it became very, very successful. And it was at the Jiangxi Soviet where he perfected many of his ideas about how to gain the support of the peasants, how to implement moderate land reform policies and so forth, to gain the support of the rich peasants as well, rather than attacking them and taking their land. So lots of key things happen as a result of the Shanghai Massacre. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so once you've done A, B and C for China, then you do question 2 and question 3 for China, and they're both worth 10 marks. So half an hour in total on these two questions, 15 minutes on question 2 and 15 minutes on question 3. So question 2, let's have a look at this. And I didn't refer to this before, but this section of the exam, okay, so section A, part 2, is probably the most difficult section of the exam, because these questions can be about any topics related to area of study 2 of the revolution that you're studying. Any topic related to the Chinese Revolution from 1949 to 1971. Okay, so, and you don't have any sources to help you either, so it has to be all your own knowledge. So they're the most difficult ones. Sometimes these can be quite easy questions. Sometimes they can ask you about more specific topics, and I think here this is a very specific topic. Explain the role of San Fan and Wu Fan in helping the communist regime to consolidate power. So if you don't know what San Fan, there's no clues here. If you don't know what San Fan and Wu Fan are, then it's very hard. If you know some Mandarin, it can help you a little bit, because San is 3 and Wu is 5 in Mandarin, and I apologise for my my lack of tones. I'm not very good at the tones in Mandarin. But anyway, so San Fan and Wu Fan, so the 3 antis and the 5 antis. That's what these questions are about. And once you know this, once you have these clues, if you know this, then the question becomes a bit easier. These are part of these these are these early campaigns. San Fan in 1952. Or 1951, sorry, San Fan 1951, and then Wu Fan in 1952, just after the communists came into power. The San Fan was when it was a campaign to identify bureaucratic corruption within the government, and also to identify former Kuomintang members, or Kuomintang government officials, and to give them some thought reform. Wulfan, that was targeted more against businesses. Okay, so the five antis. So the five antis campaign against tax evasion, fraud, excessive profiteering from government contracts, and theft of government property and bribery. The Wulfan was pretty much just an attack on the capitalist class within China. Okay, and 450,000 businesses were investigated. A result of the Wulfan campaign was that most private companies became joint companies, state-private. Okay, so that as a consequence of the Wulfan, the capitalist class lost a lot of power within China. Most of the big business private enterprises were pretty much nationalised or became joint government, private ownership. So it weakened the capitalist class, and who were the communists from communist ideology anyway, class enemies. So it weakened them. The Sanfan, that attacked Kuomintang or former Kuomintang agents or individuals who supported the Kuomintang or tried to identify those individuals who supported the Kuomintang regime before it was overthrown, ousted in 1949. And this also, the Sanfan, helped to consolidate CCP power. Okay, so Sanfan was attacking the Kuomintang, former Kuomintang agents, the Wulfan attacking the capitalist class. It contributed to this culture of spying. So there's lots of points you can have here for this question. And it made people fearful of criticising the communist regime. So the population conformed to what the communists wanted them to do. The consequence of that, it's sort of, this was then reinforced by later campaigns, such as the 100 Flowers campaign, which made the people even less prepared to criticise or question what the communists were doing, which then resulted in things like the Great Leap Forward, where you had these very, very poor agricultural policies, and which led to the 3 bad years and estimates 30 million people dying. So there's a lot of things you can talk about here. Question 3. Explain how the effects of the 3 bad years, well, there we are, there's the link. Explain how the effects of the 3 bad years, the famine, led to a compromise of revolutionary ideals. So with this question here, explain how the effects of the 3 bad years, you talk about those, led to a compromise of revolutionary ideals. So with each of these questions, with question 2 and question 3, with question 2 you try to write at least 250 words. With question 3 you'd also try to write 250 words, okay? About 15 minutes on both. So at least half, you might have 4 points. 4 main points for question 3 here, same with question 2, 4 main points for question 3. Might have a couple of points about the 3 bad years, and then what happened? How did the problems with the 3 bad years then lead to a compromise of revolutionary ideals? Okay, 3 bad years. So these are those years you would want to refer to the dates. It's during the Great Leap Forward, so 1959, 1960, 1961. And this is when you had widespread famine throughout China as a consequence of the policies that were implemented by the CCP during the Great Leap Forward, and Mao was the one who led the Great Leap Forward. Okay, he was the one who was very keen on these policies, and policies, you would have studied this, there's lots you can talk about. Backyard furnaces, the 5 pests, collectivization, work teams, work points, lots of different things you can talk about. They all come to a head in the 3 bad years. Statistical manipulation, when corrupt CCP cadres were saying that the communes that they were leading were actually harvesting more grain, more tons of grain than they actually did, which then led the government to believe that, oh, we've got heaps and heaps of grain, so we can send grain overseas, when that actually wasn't the case, when people were starving. So lots of points here. Explain the effects of the 3 bad years. Well, the 3 bad years, 1959, 1960, 1961. Millions of people died. There are varying estimates about how many people actually died. Probably the best stat to use would be Jasper Becker's. Jasper Becker's 30 million people dying during this period. And it would be good to cite his name, okay, because there are so many different estimates about the numbers of people who died. And there's a number of other events like the Cultural Revolution itself. I might talk about, the 100 Flowers campaign. Pretty much when you're citing estimates, casualty estimates, people who died and so forth, and it'll be in the millions more often than not. For China AOS2, it's best, because these estimates can fluctuate quite a bit, it's best to actually cite the author who is making this estimate. The best one for the 3 bad years is at 30 million people dying, and according to Jasper Becker. Okay? How did it lead to a compromise of revolutionary ideals? Well, pretty much as a consequence, eventually, by 1961, the CCP leadership managed to put an end to these poor policies, and Mao was forced to take a step back. And as a consequence, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping came to the fore, and they implemented some reforms, such as the reintroduction of private markets where peasants could sell their grain. Also, there was a bit of a rolling back of collectivization. These communes were made smaller, and also peasants were encouraged to grow their own grain and sell it. Okay, so which then resulted in an increase in grain production in 1962 onwards. Okay, so quite a bit there. If I was doing this exam, if I was answering this exam in 2020 and I had a choice between doing the Russian questions and the China questions for Section A, I probably would have done Russia Section A, just because you had those questions about the Duma and the October Manifesto and the fundamental laws. The sources were excellent. You could get a lot from them. And then consequences of the revolution, Russian Revolution. Question 2 was about the Civil War, thinking back. And then question 3 was about Felix Dzerzhinsky. They weren't too bad. This question here, the San Fan and the Wu Fan, that caught out some students. If you weren't up on your game and you didn't know, I know some students probably didn't even maybe mistook what San Fan and Wu Fan actually meant. Okay, the 5-year plan or something like that, which this question is not about. Okay, so that's quite a specific question, and as a consequence, I probably would have done the Russian Revolution for Section A and left Section B for China. Anyway, saying that, let's get into Section B. So here's the index here for Section B, and once again we've got Russia, page 24, China, page 26. So let's go straight to Russia, page 24. Going down, 21, 24 here. So question 1 is worth 20 marks, and that is Section B, Part 1. And then Section B, Part 2, which is the consequence of the revolution. These are those source analysis questions again, okay, in A, B, and C, just like we had in Section A, the previous section. So, there's nothing really different there. This question A, it's an essay. It's a short essay. Now, I've spoken about this before. This question, if you have a look, it's worth 20 marks. So the exam in total is worth 80 marks. So this is a quarter of your marks for the exam. You have 2 hours in total to write the exam. Since this is a quarter of your marks and a quarter of 2 hours is half an hour, so you devote half an hour to this essay. Sometimes students believe or think that the essay, and I've referred to this before, is more important, so you should spend more time on it than the other sections. That is incorrect. It's worth 20 marks, just as these 3 questions together are worth 20 marks. So you devote the same amount of time to these questions as you devote to this question up here. Anyway, let's have a look. Question 1, essay, 20 marks. The question is, the reasons for the success of the Bolsheviks in October 1917 are to be found in 3 simple words: peace, bread and land. Oh, that Lenin slogan. This is a nice essay, isn't it? So, to what extent do you agree with this view? So, the reasons for the success of the Bolsheviks in October 1917 are found in those. So, and on the flip side of that, the reason why the provisional government was overthrown in October 1917 was because they could not resolve these 3 key issues which Lenin identified: peace, an end to the war; bread, an end to the food shortages; and land, an end to the land problems, the land shortages and so forth, which were afflicting the Russian peasants and which were contributing during this period to the land seizures, etc. So quite a lot to write there. Peace, bread and land, it's a slogan. It's one of the key slogans that Lenin comes up with. The other one being all power to the Soviets. It's those sort of slogans that appeared on many of the banners that were held by protesters during the period, particularly from, say, April, May, June onwards, 1917. But there's a lot you can talk about there. That's not too hard an essay question. You're aiming for about 500 words. And in this essay question, you should be including historical interpretations as well. Okay? So make sure to include historical interpretations in this essay question. Let's get on to section B, part 2. So part 2, source 1, source 2. Only 2 sources here. And the first one is about Savnarkom. Oh, a historical interpretation of difficulties facing the new government, Savnarkom. That's source 1. And then source 2, speech by Leon Trotsky to Moscow, the Moscow Communist Party members on the 20th of October. And so that's source 2. And by October 1922, so the civil wars ended and war communism has finished. That economic policy, war communism is finished, and the NEP is being implemented. And the successes of the NEP are starting to come into the fore. So increase in industrial and agricultural production, and Russia's being pulled out of the famine that it was suffering as a consequence of both the civil war and the policies of war communism. So anyway, let's have a look at these questions. Using source 1 and your own knowledge, outline the challenges faced by the new government, Savnarkom, in consolidating its power in late 1917. Getting Russia safely out of the war, restoring and collapsing, but it had to create effective political rule. Yep, well, this isn't too bad. Opposition appeared quickly already in the final days. Oh, there's lots of things you can talk about there. Just to remind you, so you have to use source 1, so you have to include a key quote from here. In your response, using your own knowledge, outline the challenges faced by the new government, Savnarkom, in consolidating its power in late 1917. You can talk about a lot of things. I mean, by late 1917, you could talk about the implementation of state capitalism, that economic policy. You could talk about establishment of the Cheka and various other things. Okay. Question B. Using source 2 and your own knowledge, explain why Leon Trotsky believed the revolution had been a success by October 1922. Well, this is up here. I must say in praise of our party that it has set a colossal example. Today all the railways, all of the most important plants and factories, all the most valuable natural resources in the country in the hands of the state. So that's quite interesting. You could talk about nationalisation. You could talk about the decree on nationalisation, which was a part of war communism. Okay, June 1918, I think that was, off the top of my head, first implemented. Okay, when many of the big banks and the big sort of private companies started to get nationalised. So I believe the revolution had been a success. So all these private capitalist firms have been taken over by the government and the state, and in the hands of the workers now. So that's just one thing you could talk about. There's a lot here. Look, not a single revolution was ever accomplished without a lowering of the country. Oh yeah, class struggle and so forth. Okay. Believe the revolution to be a success. I mean, they've won the Civil War. There's another point there from your own knowledge. Lots of different things. Overcome counter-revolutionaries in various forms. You might talk about the Kronstadt sailors, Kronstadt uprising, etc. So there's lots you could talk about there. And then finally C, analyse the extent to which revolutionary leaders compromised their revolutionary ideals. Use evidence to support your response. So you can use these sources. Once again, you could use these sources 1 and 2, but you don't need to. But you do need to include historical interpretations of your own. 2 would be good. More if you can. And you want to write at least 250 words for this response, and you want to spend at least 15 minutes on it. The key's the time. You might write 300 words or more, so long as you do it within 15 minutes. Then that's the main thing. Analyse the extent to which revolutionary leaders compromise their revolutionary ideals. Use evidence to support your response. One of the key points you can talk about here is economic policy, for example. You could talk about, if you focused a lot on state capitalism in your response to question A up here, then you might not want to do as much down here, but you can certainly talk about the NEP, and that is in no way a communist economic policy. War communism was an economic policy, but that failed. That's why they had to bring in the NEP and all of the things, all the policies in relation to the NEP. Okay, plus other things as well. So there's a lot you can talk about there. So they're not too hard, those questions. Let's go on to section B for the Chinese Revolution. So turning over the page, and once again we've got the essay for outcome number 1, China, 1912 to 1949, and then these source analyses and the 3 questions for outcome number 2, which is once the Chinese, the CCP get into power. So let's have a look. Question number 1. Mao Zedong thought Maoism was essential for the success of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. To what extent do you agree with this view? Maoism. So there's lots of different points you could discuss about Maoism. Once again, I referred to it in the previous section. If you're going to do the China questions on outcome number 1, the Hunan report you could talk about here. Maoism, the idea that the peasants were the revolutionary class. You might talk about, so you could talk about that. Other things you could talk about with Maoism, you'd have to talk about the mass line. You could talk about thought reform at Yan'an, how that consolidated CCP power and Mao's leadership in particular. Lots of stuff you can talk about. Redistribution of land, that key CCP policy. So you could talk about that as well. So there's lots there you can talk about. And then for source 1 and 2, what have we got here? Source 1, an extract from Mao Zedong's opening speech at the First National People's Congress, 1954. And then source 2, a historical interpretation describing the importance of the Chinese Communist Party in the new political system, published in 2015. All right, and the questions. Using source 1 in your own knowledge, outline the challenges facing the new regime. Okay, so once again, we're going to get a key quote from here. And what does he refer to here? Let's just scan through. Themselves to build our country, which is at present economically and culturally backward, into a great industrialised country with a high standard of modern culture in the course of several 5-year plans. Well, straight away you could talk about the first 5-year plan. Second 5-year plan is a great leap forward. So outline the challenges facing the new regime. The economic challenge, that's the key there. That's what you can talk about there. You can talk about the first 5-year plan, the policies that were implemented there, which led to increased industrial growth, increased coal output, steel output, and so forth. Lots to talk about there. B, using source 2 and your own knowledge, explain the political changes in China. And this is all about the party organisation. Okay, and the role of the CCP. So using source 2 and your own knowledge, explain the political changes in China. Yep, that's easy. Well, one of the big political changes is the GMD's overthrown. And you can talk about, in particular, focus on the Politburo, which plays such a key role. Okay, and then question C, analyse the significance of the new political system in enabling the Chinese Communist Party leadership to consolidate power. And the new political system itself, Mao Zedong was not elected at all. There were elections at the lower level within the government, but not at the upper level. So pretty much Mao Zedong, he chose who was going to be premier, he chose who was going to be foreign minister, and so forth. Okay, so when you're answering this response, question C, analyse the significance of the new political system. That unity in purpose, that control that the CCP had over Chinese society, enabled them to implement various economic policies, enabled them to implement the various mass campaigns, the 100 Flowers campaign, the Cultural Revolution, and it enabled Mao Zedong to consolidate his power. Once we get to the Cultural Revolution, Mao even turns upon the CCP itself. So, and he becomes the great helmsman. Okay, so there's lots you can talk about there. Once again, you want to have a couple of historical interpretations. All right, so anyway, that is my overview of the 2020 exam. I hope it has been helpful, and I'll see you next time.